There we go. Can you hear me? All right. Good evening. My name is Sam Reed, and I am a member of the Des Moines Public Library Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you tonight to AViD. The library has been hosting AViD since 2001, and we're so happy that you are here. The Des Moines Public Library Foundation is honored to support this library program, and each year, there's a special thank you that we would like to give to sponsors that help make this happen. Those sponsors are Nationwide Foundation, Brad and Kelly Edmister, Pamela Bass, Bookie, and Harry Bookie, Humanities Iowa, a state-based Iowa affiliation of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Mary Kay and Daniel M. Kelly Family Foundation, Kay and Bob Riley. Can you guys hear me okay on this? All right. Cultivating Compassion, the Richard Deming Foundation, Douglas and Deborah West, Shelley and Martin Brody, Jan Freed and John Fisher, Dory Browse, Don Taylor, Judy Blank, Rachel Stauffer, and Jim Lawson, and Barbara and John Yankee. Let's give them a round of applause for their support. Offering outstanding authors for AViD, free programs, the latest technology and new initiatives takes money, and it takes more than just the tax dollars that are provided. So we do ask that if you are able to, that you help. There is donation envelopes that you may have found at your seat that can be given at the tables outside of the door. And then a couple of details before we get started. There is an evaluation form that you will have received as well. You can either complete this and turn it in at the end of the evening, or complete the evaluation form online. That goes to help support and tell the value that you received from programs that are being funded by the Des Moines Public Library Foundation. Also, over here, we would like for you to consider purchasing a book from Beaverdale Books and get that autographed by our author. 10% of each of those purchase sales are donated to the foundation. I would now like to introduce Rachelle Chase, our moderator tonight. She is an author herself, and she's an author about books from Buxton, Iowa, in which she tells the fascinating story of the unincorporated mining town in the early 1900s, where African American and Caucasian residents lived, worked, and attended school together. She is now an opinion columnist with the Des Moines Register and founder of a nonprofit, Uniting Through History, whose mission is to further the acceptance of and pride in the fact that Black history is American history. Please help me welcome Rachelle Chase.
Okay, I'm going to try this. First of all, I wanted to say thank you for letting me moderate this. When Tim invited me to do this, he told me the title of the book, and I said, yes, I want to do this. This sounds great. And then it dawned on me that I knew nothing about the book, and I thought, what if I don't like it? And I'm going to be up here, interviewing this author. But fortunately, I loved the book, so I'm really excited to be here today, and I love being here as a person who gets to ask questions and not be asked. So I just wanted to say also the format of this, I'm going to introduce Paul. You have these question cards there. Rather than saving the questions towards the end, I'd love it if you fill these out, and then I'll start off the questions, and then we'll intersperse some of your questions with mine. So feel free to fill them out, give them to Tim as you think of them. So let me introduce Paul. Author and journalist Paul Kicks's work has appeared in The New Yorker, GQ, ESPN, The Wall Street Journal, and more. His first book, The Saboteur, was a nonfiction bestseller about the thrilling true life story of Robert de la Rochefoucauld, a member of the French aristocracy who became a resistance fighter during World War II. The 2023 film, The Accidental Getaway Driver, is based on Kicks's thrilling 2017 feature article for GQ about a man abducted by 3 prison escapees. His newest book, You Have to Be Prepared to Die Before You Can Begin to Live, was released May 2nd. The deeply researched book takes readers in ways never explored before, behind the scenes of the momentous 1963 Birmingham campaign, 10 weeks that shaped the course of the civil rights movement and the future of America. In a starred review, Publishers Weekly said of the book, Kix makes a persuasive case that Birmingham saved a floundering organization and galvanized the Kennedy administration to commit to civil rights. Readers will be riveted from the first page to the last, and that is true. Kix grew up on a farm in Iowa, graduated from Iowa State University, and now lives in Connecticut with his wife and 3 children. Please welcome Paul Kix to the stage for tonight's AViD discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here. Thrilling to be here. so many faces that I know. So I'll save more comments for later.
Awesome. Can you hear me? Is this on? Yeah. Okay. So I kind of wanted to start off with the prologue because I think the prologue to the book is also very impactful. And there's a couple of things that you say where you talk about George Floyd happening and your family watching that, your wife, your kids. And I wanted to know if you saw parallels between your family watching George Floyd and, you know, the experience of your family with the children and what was happening in Birmingham. That was one question. And then secondly, you say you write the book for your family, for yourself and your readers. I just wanted to know more about that.
Yeah, those are great questions.
Mm.
So maybe the easiest way to answer the first is to start with why George Floyd. So my wife Sonia grows up in primarily in 5th Ward of Houston. That's the neighborhood adjacent to 3rd Ward where George Floyd grew up. Sonia was George's age when George was murdered, 46. Sonia had some of her closest friends and cousins go to Yates High, where George Floyd went to high school. So all those years later, when we are watching George die on CNN, it feels very much personal. My wife, Sonia, my mother-in-law, Connie, who also grew up in inner city Houston, they're seeing somebody that they know of, though they do not directly know. What that means is in our house in Connecticut, George Floyd's death was the first time that my wife and I did not shield our 3 kids from coverage of black men, innocent black men, being killed by law enforcement officers, by body cam footage or the cell phone camera footage that Donnell Fraser captured that went all around the world with George Floyd's death. So, as a result of that, my twin boys in particular had a lot of questions. They were 9 at the time, and a lot of them were, are all cops racist? But beneath that was this question that sort of led down to this idea of identity itself. Am I inferior in some way because of the color of my skin? And Sonia and I decided to embark on a project that moved from a book project to a family project very quickly. It was a chance to sort of chronicle our response to very troubling and hard questions and try to find some sort of answer and a semblance for perhaps a life ahead. And the reason to now, this is perhaps the part of why Birmingham, the images of 1963 went, as we would say today, viral in their own way. The SCLC very much wanted America to see what was happening in Birmingham, because what was happening in Birmingham was really a metaphor for the Black experience itself. And the thinking was, if they could, in some ways, entice Bull Connor to act as he had always acted throughout the whole of his life, then perhaps they could get what no one had granted them since emancipation, which was real and lasting civil rights legislation. Across 100 years, nothing had changed. Birmingham happens, and then everything changes. Leads to the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, King's death in 68, leads to a new life for his country. It leads to the rise of the Black middle and upper class. It leads not only to Barack Obama's presidency, but it really leads to my ability to marry Sonia in a former Jim Crow state like Texas, and to raise our 3 kids today on a shaded street where no one harasses us for who we are. So I dedicate that book to my kids as a way to show them that whatever you guys are going through right now in the latter half of 2020, and they went through a lot. 2020, and really the pandemic as a whole, but a lot of what happened around the sort of reckoning in America in 2020 was hard in many households. It was certainly hard in mine. I don't know if it was hard in yours. How we dealt with that in my house was, you have to be prepared to die before you can begin to live. And it's a chronicle not only of those 10 weeks in Birmingham that changed the course and the trajectory of America, but to me, it's a guide for how we can all live. The guide of courage and ingenuity and kindness and perseverance. That's why I wrote that book. And that's also the connection to, like, I guess, bridging that divide, you know. I want to show that there's what happened then. We can draw ourselves together today and find a path forward in the same way that they did in 1963 and change the whole of America in the process.
Touched upon some of this in that answer, but you also say that you personally learned a lot, you know, in writing this book. And so what are some of the things that you learned? And I don't necessarily at this point mean like the facts, but it's such an emotional book. There were parts of it that I cried. You put so much of the story and depth to it. So I guess I want to know what moved you, or what really impacted you in writing this book?
I think when we think of the civil rights movement, we have a very familiar set of images at the ready. We have grainy black and white images. We have, particularly in Birmingham, the images of fire-hosed kids, right? What amazed me about that research was we should not cast them in angelic hues. Okay, let's stop with this. They were very real and very flawed people, and in their flaws was their humanity. Let's just say it plainly. There were senior members of the SCLC that did not get along at all. If anybody's read this book, they'll see the way that James Bevel and Wyatt Walker, 2 of the senior-most deputies beneath King, openly despised each other. They had this idea this sort of motto of, these preachers could sure kneel before God, but my God, they could stand quite tall before each other. They had huge egos, every single one of them. I don't say that in a way to demean them. I say that as a way to show their humanity. They were people. They were flawed people. They were fully formed people. And that's what I wanted to relay, because we are all flawed and fully formed people at the same time. So let's stop with the history of King as like some sort of deity almost. Let's make him a man. Let's make him who he was. And let's surround him with people who, frankly, in Birmingham, did far more than he did to make that campaign a success. That was one of the biggest parts of it, where I was like, I have got to show that. I've got to show their interpersonal relationships, and I've got to show the way that it's really the deputies beneath King who make that campaign a success. I was asked earlier, like, is he almost a coward? At times he is. In 1963, he's pretty much a coward, and it's his deputies who step forward to lead that campaign. That's what I wanted this book to do.
That's another thing that really stood out, is the deep point of view that you go in for each of these characters. And we see their strengths. Like, I learned things about King, not only that part, but I didn't know he was really indecisive, couldn't make up his mind. You show Kennedy, a lot of times we have the myth that, the Kennedys embraced civil rights, from day one. They were this. And so you show that, no, that was not true. It was very much about politics. They were afraid to embrace this because they didn't want to ruin JFK's chances for re-election. So you show that journey. My point is that you go into when I read each chapter, I really feel like I'm experiencing what that character thought, the fears they had, the strengths they had. How did you get that much depth? I mean, how did you research that to be able to really bring those characters to life? And was all of that true? I mean, how much is fiction versus,
All true. So let's take the last half first. All of it's true. There are 60 pages of endnotes in the back if you want to source it for yourself. But I write all of that to actually address that question because it's one that I get. And I actually want to be asked that. Why? Because I want every single book I write to read like a novel. I want people to just get into a story and never once think I am reading history. I want that thing to, Michael Lewis, I'll have to put this down for a second. He's like, I want my books to move. And if you've read any of Michael Lewis's books, you'll see that like they are gripping narratives. And every time I'm like, I want my book to move. So to your question about how do I get it? So there are an early plug, and I'll promise not to be doing too much of it. There are books on sale over there, and please let's make Beaverdale Books very happy tonight and buy all the copies. In addition to You Have to Be Prepared to Die Before You Can Begin to Live, you'll see a copy of The Saboteur. The reason I bring up The Saboteur is because these books were diametrically opposite in their research. Saboteur, I was chasing a ghost. I told the Register this today. I was chasing a ghost. Robert, across, like, if you were captured by the Nazis, you were killed, and your family, before you were killed, was brought before the Nazis so that they could extract more information from you, and then your family was killed in front of your eyes. That's why there's no paper trail for any of those resistance fighters. Way too dangerous. So what happens as a result? Well, for me, 50 years later, I have to spend 4 years researching that book across 5 different countries just to amass the amount of information I can to tell The Saboteur. You Have to Be Prepared to Die Before You Can Live, completely different. The sheer amount of material. Birmingham Public Library and the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute over the last 30 years have carried out perhaps the largest oral history campaign of any such oral history campaign I've seen. Over 300 interviews with basically everybody that played any role and any significance in Birmingham. Each of these interviews, sometimes scores of pages, sometimes hundreds of pages. That's one tranche of information. Then there are the memoirs. Then there are the interviews from that moment. Then there are the histories that are written about it. Then there's the sort of ethnographic academic studies about it, both from that time and a little bit later. So how do I dip into their heads? Because they said it, right? They said it either in 1963 or 1968, or if there was the kids who was protesting in 1994, they told their stories. And I realized what a privilege this was. This was going to elevate this book because I was going to be able not only to say, here is what really happened, not only here is why it happened, but here is what they thought as it happened. And that's where I'm like, this thing, read for yourself, but I'm like, this thing.
So how long then did it take you with all of this? With
the research?
Yeah, with the research and then to write it then. How long of a project?
It was the research. I mean, it was easier than the saboteur insofar as I knew that it was basically all in the South. Like if it's not in Birmingham, it's in Atlanta. If it's not in Atlanta, it's in Richmond, Virginia. And there's all these different university libraries that housed all these different things that I needed. So I knew where to get it. But the problem was then how do I organize it? And so I had to create a notes of notes system. I had to create an index for those notes. It was just like I was writing down what I was writing down, basically. It was just insane. And it was insane because when I sit down to write, I don't want to have to think, wait, where's that thing that I knew was important, and then lose half. I write in the mornings, then lose half the morning trying to find the thing. So it would become notes of notes and structures of structures, and eventually it got to the point where it was like, okay, I know where this is, I know how to find it, and just proceeded that way. All told, from June of 2020 is when I signed the book deal for it, and then I'm done with the last draft in December of 22. So it was, by book standard, you're like, well, that's a long time. By book standards, that's actually, and you know this, it's at a fairly quick pace. Yeah.
I wasn't thinking that's a long time
No.
at all. I was like, for that book? Oh my goodness.
No, because what I wanted to get to the point, frankly, I wanted to get to tonight. And what I mean by that is, like, I wanted to get to the 60th anniversary. I'm like, if this thing misses its spring 2023 60th anniversary, this thing misses everything. You need to have it, you need to have it come out on the anniversary to help sales. I promise I won't do that.
Great. Okay, let's take a few audience questions here. Let's see, the first one. Why don't people know more about Fred Shuttlesworth?
Why? I don't know.
Based on your book, he was the real leader. Seems like an oversight in history.
Yes. Whoever wrote that, I agree with you 100%. Fred Shuttlesworth is the bravest American I have ever come across in my life. He is pretty much single-handedly protesting in Birmingham before King at a time when the Klan is castrating black men as a means to intimidate Fred, at a time when he has to go console black women who are being raped by police officers in their patrol cars, at a time when Edward R. Murrow of CBS goes down to Birmingham just prior to King, and he says to his producer as he leaves town, I have not seen any place like this since Nazi Germany. That was Birmingham, Alabama. And that was the Birmingham, Alabama before King that Fred Shuttlesworth said, I want equality. If you guys take nothing else from this, look into Fred's life. Like, he should be an American hero that every single person knows.
And that's something you captured really well, the extreme violence and racism and just what Birmingham was like at that time. Bull O'Connor, I did not realize he was as bad as you portrayed him. I mean, I knew he was bad, but you really shone a light on that. Okay. How did growing up on a farm in Iowa influence you as a journalist and writer?
Great question. In every possible way. I write in the mornings because I'm best in the early mornings. Why am I best in the early mornings? Because when I was in 4th grade, I had to start feeding my 4-H cattle at 6 a.m. When I was in 9th grade, I had to go lift weights for the football team at 6 a.m. And then I had to come back to do homework and then go to school. This was the Iowa way. And to raise my kids now in Connecticut, where they're like, I'm tired, it's 7:45. I'm like... And they were like, and Dad, don't tell me about your cattle and what it was like. I'm like, okay. It's good to be back in Iowa.
This is one I had also. How did you settle on the title of the book? we hear, I think it was Shuttlesworth
Yeah.
that says this. But what could you just give some background about when he says that, why he says it, and how that related to the title?
Yeah. So, all right. So to set the stage a little bit, everything that I just said about Bull Connor in the South and Birmingham in particular is true. Most violent, most racist place in America. SCLC was openly despised back then by other civil rights groups. John Lewis's much younger Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, some of its members sneered at King, called him Delawed, which was basically like a euphemism on how pompous King was, and they called him a phony to his face. The Southern and Northern press ridiculed King. And what this did, and they had never won across like 7 different years of a campaign. What this did was it makes the SCLC very, very vulnerable going down to Birmingham. So as a result of that, they're broke. All right, so this is where the quote comes from. So they're figuring out, well, if there's this huge gamble of a campaign, how do we win when we've had nothing but losses as the SCLC across 7 years? But there's the even larger gamble of how can we finance this thing? The SCLC still had some people that were very faithful to it. And a minor character here and a guy who just died is Harry Belafonte. Harry Belafonte, yeah. If people know that history, they're nodding their heads. If you don't know that history, you're going to read some of it here. Harry Belafonte, at a time when no other actor is taking these sort of stance, says, basically, I'm going to give up my career for the movement. And he does. So Harry Belafonte holds this fundraiser of all these deep-pocketed New Yorkers in his apartment. And they're like, how can we raise money? Well, let's bring in Fred. Let's have Fred tell stories of his life from Birmingham. And he does, and it's amazing. And somebody asks, the rough paraphrase is, the question is like, how did you persevere? And Fred says, you have to be prepared to die before you can begin to live. And that was just like, whoa. And then they pour out $475,000 they donate that night, which today, I don't have the calculator in front of me, is somewhere in the neighborhood of like $4 million just from that one fundraiser. Why that for the title? You read civil rights books, and a lot of them have some sort of biblical, I shouldn't say that's nothing wrong, I guess, because these were all like Christian, these were all pastors. But, it's like, and I love Branches Parting the Waters. I cite it here often. Carry Me Home's another one. Just these sort of uplifting. I was like, dude, that wasn't Birmingham. There should be nothing uplifting. It should get to the danger of that place. And yeah, the only thing that can capture that is you have to be prepared to die before you can begin to live. So that's why that's title.
Great. Yeah, and when you mentioned some of these other players, like I think that wasn't a thing when you're talking about Harry Belafonte as well. Again, getting into more detail of his activism and just how much wealth he had. The fact that he bailed him out, wrote a check for, what was it when they needed it the second time?
Oh,
like 50,000 or 100.
it was yes, I think it was 50 when they had to get him out. And like Harry Belafonte, man, Harry Belafonte he loses his first marriage to the movement. His first wife gets tired when the FBI stops by one too many times asking to buy his activism. He loses millions of dollars. He gives millions of dollars ultimately to the movement. And that's in 1963 money. And, there are people like, Hollywood producers don't want to work with him. They're like, who are you? We can't work with somebody who's this much of an activist. You need to come back to Hollywood. And no, that's not who Harry Belafonte was. Yeah.
And just one last thing, I'll leave him. You made something that made me laugh when you talked about, was it Johnny Carson had said that Harry Belafonte, he's such a nice guy, and that made him angry. He's like, I am not a nice guy.
Yeah.
And, and so you had, moments like that. Again, we're in that character's, mind, and they're getting upset at this, label that.
Because Harry would say this, like, there's something demeaning about that. It's because it comes back. It really, in some sense, it comes back to race. It's like, well, he's a nice guy, and what that really means is Harry is approachable because he is himself of mixed race, and this is something that like other black activists talked about at the times. They say, well, Harry isn't black. That makes him approachable. And Harry hated those sort of designations. He's like, I am just as much an activist as anybody else. And so yeah, like it's sort of, it's always barbed. It's a little bit barbed with somebody like Harry. I actually think, and I mentioned this in passing, that either in spite of his skin tone or perhaps because of his skin tone, that's why he became such an ardent activist in the 1960s.
Okay, another question from the audience. What role did librarians play in your research for this book? Any great examples of stories about librarians?
Who could this possibly be coming from? Could it be coming from my good friend Tim Pollock? So this is cool. In Birmingham happens in 1963. There are some reforms. There's a black police officer who enters the force in the late 1960s. I think it's somewhere in the 1970s that there are black elected officials in Birmingham. However, South does a really good job, as do many other places, of making sure that you don't know your own history. So it's the 1980s now, and there's no record of this. There's nothing to suggest what actually happened in 63. There's a guy, his name is Jim Baggett. Jim, in the 1980s, he hears this rumor. Bull Connor had secretly recorded all of the mass meetings that took place in 1963. In addition to that, Bull Connor then had his white detectives transcribe all of these meetings. Where do these documents exist? Where are they? So Jim Baggett goes to the police department, and the police department's like, I can't help you at all. I don't know where those would be. But so Jim Baggett has to basically find it, and it's in a separate set of archives, and it's a treasure trove. It's hundreds, if not thousands of pages. Everything that happened on a night-to-night basis when King and the SCLC were down in Birmingham. Everything about their strategy, everything about, it was amazing. Nobody had access to this. And that set in motion, I mean, I mentioned Taylor Branch's book, Parting the Waters. It made that book possible, made basically hundreds of other documentaries and stories and books possible, made my book possible in some way because I was relying on those very same things. But then, to bring it full circle, we had that question earlier about the oral histories. So Jim Baggett, he realizes, well, we've got to get to everybody. How do we do that? He finds this guy, Wayne Lawson, who's interested in research and archives, and Wayne's like, well, let's start to interview people. And so beginning in the 1980s, they start to interview people. It becomes like the first part of this oral history campaign. And then after that, they interview enough where they're like, now we're going to start a civil rights institute. So in the 1990s, they found the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And the reason I tell you guys all of this, otherwise just about research, is because it's not just about research. Like those primary documents are what makes every single story we tell possible. And it was the bravery of, and Tim has suddenly decided to leave the room, but it's the bravery of librarians that really, that made that possible. This is not the only time that happens, by the way. I'm always very keen on primary documents, and this was one of those instances where the story behind the primary document was almost as good as the documents themselves.
It's amazing that, all of that still existed, that it wasn't destroyed in some kind of way.
He was really trying to fight, that he wanted to make sure, because it was in dusty archives where like mold could get into the papers and all the rest. But yeah, he got them out before, and they started to make copies of them like as quickly as they could, right? Yeah.
Wow. Okay, let me switch to just one question I had here. I just wanted to know, as a white man writing about this, this history, and again, getting so deep into the minds of the characters, and granted you had all these oral histories and all these original documents, but was there any trepidation at all for you in writing this book? Any concerns of any kind about that? Any discomfort? Anything?
Sonia's my first reader, so she helped to displace a lot of that. I also had Connie, my mother-in-law, who grew up not in the Alabama, but in Jim Crow South. She grew up in Houston. So broadly speaking, anything there about like what was Black life ultimately like, I could rely on them in addition to the primary documents themselves. You know, the reservation might have surfaced actually with the audiobook, to be honest, because later in the book, like Fred Shuttlesworth, incredibly brave man, basically self-educated, but doesn't have nearly the rhetorical polish of somebody like King. And very accurately, other people have transcribed what Fred said when he got furious with Martin in the spring of 1963, and thought there might be some sort of class divide between them that was longstanding. And basically, the reason I bring this up is because he dips into a sort of vernacular that I, as a white guy, would no way in 2023 think to approach reading it. And so I was like, when my publisher and I were thinking, well, who do you want? I was like, I can do the prologue and the epilogue since that's basically my story. But I was like, he needs to be Black. He needs to be from the South. He needs to, if possible, be a member of a Southern Baptist church, or at least familiar with Black Christendom in general. And like those were the criteria, and the guy that we found fit all of that. And when Sonia and I talked with him, it was like, okay, when James Bevel's from Mississippi, that's a little bit of a different sort of cultural understanding than somebody from Atlanta, right? Which is in turn a little bit different from somebody like Fred in Birmingham, who grew up a hog farmer. So yeah, I wanted him to capture all of that.
Okay, let's go back to a question here. Oh my, you guys are challenging my old eyes here. Maybe I have to take this off. Let's see. Of all the facts that you found, which one was most fascinating for you? Oh, there's 3 questions here. Once you saw the picture that grabbed your interest, where did you start your research? And has this book been optioned for a movie?
Let's go.
First question.
First question.
Of all the facts that you found, which one was the most fascinating for you?
Of all the facts that I found, the most fascinating would probably have to be just how immoral Wyatt Walker was. Wyatt Walker was the SCLC's executive director in 1963, and he was King's number 2. And he had what King called the keenest mind in the movement. And while Walker described it was, I will alter my sense of morality if it means that we can win. And, once you get to the chapter on that's just called Double D-Day in May of 1963, I think you'll get what I mean when I say he was a Christian pastor, but he was perhaps a very deeply flawed, morally person. Now, was that for an end? Was that to serve an end? Yes. Did he succeed in that? Yes. Was there criticism of it? Yes. Was it necessary? Perhaps. These are questions that people like us can weigh endlessly. Wyatt Walker would say, I did what I had to do to win. That was the thing that was most surprising to me. Second question?
Second question. Once you saw the picture that grabbed your interest, where did you start your research?
The first thing I wanted to figure out, so in the summer of 2020, after all this happened, I knew this was a family project. It was like a book project. I was like, surely somebody must have done in the past some book that was just about those 10 weeks in Birmingham. Like, I'll kill this project off right here if I can find that book. And the civil rights canon might be the richest in American letters, perhaps outside of the Civil War, right? There is not one book that just talks about these 10 weeks in Birmingham. There's not one book that says these 10 weeks in Birmingham, I'll say there's not one book that says these 10 weeks in Birmingham changed America in ways that no other period of life had changed it before. And I was like, that's the book I have to write. So where did I go? Where I went first was to the other books. Do any of these books exist? No. Okay, now it's on. And the third question was what? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I forgot to hold about the mic. So that photo, though, going back to that, that impacted you. How did you go from that photo to writing, this book?
So the photo, my interest in the photo actually, right after the boys were born, I became obsessed with this photo because I saw sort of the whole of America captured in this one image. It's perhaps the most iconic image. You can, if you have a copy, it's like, well, it's right here actually. It's Walter Gadsden being attacked by a German Shepherd, and I describe like why it fascinates me in the book. But that happens in like 2011, 2012. That sort of deep obsession with the book, deep obsession with the image, and then it's really only when I see that perhaps the virality of the images in 2023 have a tie to what happened in 1963 did I start the research, and then to the books, the histories and the archives and all that stuff after that. The last question was
Right,
about
the last question
options.
is yes. Has the book been optioned for a movie?
What I can say is we have had very positive talks with a couple of.
I'm not surprised.
Thank you.
What do you hope your readers gain from reading your books?
Books, plural. I like that. All right, not just one. Let's read them all, right? I hope what they gain is, I'll give away the whole game right here. The stories that I write, they tend to be stories that are about people facing unbelievably long odds who find a way to win and persevere anyway, despite those odds. And they are severely tested in the process, but they succeed. There's just something about, nevertheless, I succeed that I love. And I think those are always be the books that I want to tell.
Okay. This happens to be Pride Month 2023. Any comments related to how Bayard Ruskin may have...
Bayard Ruskin.
Bayard, okay. Gosh, I can't read. Bayard Ruskin may have been treated as he fit into the major participants, as there was not much openness about gay persons.
Bayard, a very large civil rights figure, doesn't feature prominently in this book, not because he doesn't feature prominently in the civil rights movement, but because his role here is somewhat diminished. He spends about half his time in those 10 weeks between Birmingham and New York, actually. I don't think that there were really a whole lot of people in 1963 that were that open to gay rights. I will tell you that in 1999 to 2003, when Tim and I were at Iowa State, we saw the fight for gay rights as sort of an extension of the civil rights era. We saw, like Sonia and I were married in Texas in our gay friend's backyard before gay people could be married. I think today that thinking would evolve, but I think it was Obama and Clinton and a lot of politicians who are fairly current today did not have those views initially, and their thinking evolves, which is fine, which is like the way that life should work, right? Like you should take in more information. You should say, well, this is now what I believe, and this is, like that's the point, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. Switching back to something I wanted to talk about as it relates to Martin Luther King, there was one part where you dispelled kind of another myth, where you said almost everyone who thought Martin Luther King Jr.'s pacifism equaled timidity didn't understand pacifism or King, because King had never been timid. King had always been bold, and that boldness stemmed from the rage he felt. So I want to just talk about this. This is kind of a mistake that I think a lot of people make, especially people that don't know much about King, except he had the peaceful, he was nonviolent. And so there's this romanticism of kind of like, oh yes, King was a great guy because in a way he wasn't threatening. Whereas you're kind of saying the opposite. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how some of this was a surprise to his parents?
Yeah. So to be to be a nonviolent protester might be the most courageous thing that you could possibly do in the world, because you have to stand there as somebody else is beating you and not fight back. You have to stand there, and then as you get knocked down, stand up again so you can be knocked down again. And you have to do this over and over, day after day, week after week, month after month, with one aim in mind, that eventually somebody's going to see your suffering and say, that should stop. You can't be the one to stop it. Gandhi first proved this in India. King and the rest proved it through the South in the 1960s. The only way nonviolence works is when actually the violent person realizes his or her actions are wrong. That's what happened with British imperialists in India, and that's what ultimately happens in America as a result of the civil rights movement. So there is nothing timid about it, even though you are not striking a blow. That's how I guess I would respond. But there was you had a little bit more shading to that.
Yeah, because you had said something about his parents were surprised.
Oh, so yeah, King was so precocious from such a young age that they were surprised when he would sometimes, like, his younger brother AD was one time harming, like making fun of their older sister, and repeatedly. And it got to the point where Martin raised up a phone and like conked AD 2 or 3 times across the head with it. And AD ran away in tears, not just because he was hurt, but because he was stunned. Like, I can't believe that Martin was the one to do that. Neither could his parents. They called Martin, our great little negotiator, but they meant it in an almost demeaning, frankly, almost emasculating sort of way. Like, look at this guy. He thinks he can actually, he's going to play the violent guy for a second. He's our great little negotiator. For King realized from a very early age that he could play with people's perceptions of who he was. And in Birmingham, he used rage very well at a time when other Black Baptist pastors did not want to stand behind him. He, and I detail this across a couple chapters, shamed them into the movement through his sort of rhetorical rage. And nobody had been expecting that. They're like, you're supposed to be king. You're the, again, you're almost like the deity here. Like, what? No, that was not the guy that they found in Birmingham.
When you're talking about, being trained in nonviolence, of getting up, getting struck, getting up, not fighting back, I think another thing that was really chilling and heartbreaking was when you were talking about the children being trained in this, the children being trained on how to do this. And I think there was one quote, this was from Bevel, that also brought tears to my eyes, where he said, they asked him how old the kids could be to participate in this. And he said, any child old enough to walk to church was old enough to march for freedom. And this also is just, a testament to what life was like for these children in this time.
Yeah.
They're going to experience it anyway, whether it's today, whether it's tomorrow, they might as well, do this now.
Yeah. I want to just sort of accentuate this point. This is something that really surprised me, what it was actually like. We see the grainy footages, see the grainy images. If I can find it, hold on one second. I want to get to this one passage that I want to read from Double D Day. Hold on just one second. I should know exactly what page it's on. I don't know my own book. So this is the day that like lives in infamy, right? This is the day of the we've seen the images of the fire hose children, okay? But what they didn't know, I'll read a little bit of this. They would march out that day in groups of 50. And they had initially turned the hoses to half power. And half power was going to just floor them, these kids. The firefighters did not even want the power used at half power. They did. And there's this image Uh-oh, is that us? Is that a warning, or are we good? Okay. All right. There are these kids, these 10 kids who, when it was at half power, they didn't stand down. They locked arms with each other, and it still gives me chills. They put their hands in the air like this, and they're all singing freedom songs then. That's how they gave each other courage that day. All these kids, 10, 12 to 18 years old, these high schoolers, half power, and they're singing one word over and over, freedom. You see them holding each other, completely drenched in the middle of Kelly Ingram Park, and they're holding each other like this. Bull Connor sees this. Those images by the national press, the national press is there by like 300, 400 reporters. International presses, Cronkite's camera crews, everybody's there. They see this. This infuriates Bull Connor. So he says, blast them with that water. Turn it on at full power. And the firefighters were like, and I'm just going to quote here. One of them said, "Good Lord, I was scared to death about what might happen if they turned the nozzles to full power." That's a firefighter. And then they did it. The singing stopped immediately, as if from automatic machine gun fire, in the words of someone present. The force of the water flattened the kids. One teenage boy tried to rise again, and a stream hit him square in the face and backflipped him. These fire hoses, either held by 4 men or mounted on metal tripods, so highly pressurized the water that its power could knock bricks loose from mortar or strip the bark from trees at a distance of 100 feet. The water struck down some children at perhaps 30 feet. It stripped the shirt off one boy, just kind of disintegrated it. The kids shouted in agony as they began a slow retreat, slow because some children kept trying to stand against the water's wrath. They did not want to leave the park. It was at that point that James Bevel sent out the next 50 kids, reinforcements. From then on, the day showcased an almost otherworldly bravery and savagery. One girl walked into the water and it cartwheeled her through the park, end over end. When the water hit another girl, it flattened her on the sidewalk. The firemen then had the cruelty to focus that hissing stream on her exposed back. The water slid her perhaps 50 feet down the street as she screamed in pain and fear. Elsewhere, children huddled under trees or light poles or just attempted to use each other as shields against the rushing, stinging fury. We could hear the firemen yelling, "Knock the N-words down," one girl later said. The crowd, some 3,000 people, and again, some of them parents, a lot of them were parents there that day who were watching, retaliated. They threw whatever was near at the firefighters, bottles, rocks, even the bricks that the fire hoses had dislodged. Bull Connor did not like that. He ordered the firemen to train the water on the crowd too. This only increased the debris thrown at the firemen. The fight was on now. Mass arrests, cops cracking people across the skull. Footage shows victims bleeding from their temples, and Bull antagonizing the crowd by hopping into a white tank of his. He drove this white tank around town and driving it up and down 16th Street North. And still, the next group of 50 protesters, the hissing water, the screaming children, the freedom songs between the screams, Bevel rushing out another 50, because what was a metaphor of the black experience in America if not this moment? And 14-year-old Carolyn McKinstry being in this group, trying to act bravely, trying to sing, marching into the park as the water leveled the kids in front of her, and now her too, hitting her in the face and hissing across her hairline, pulling it from the roots, scalping her effectively, and making her cry in pain. And then they released the Canine Corps.
Yeah,
That was Birmingham in 1963.
makes me cry again. Did you have conversations with your family in Iowa, parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, etc., about their memories of the media coverage, newspaper, TV, etc., of the civil rights movement?
Well, my mom is here with her Aunt Patrice. Hi, Mom. Aunt Patrice. Aunt Kathy is there. My Uncle Mark. There are my cousin. My goodness, there's so many. This is like a Hubbard reunion right here. This is fantastic. There's a lot of family members here. But to answer your question, I don't think that you have. I mean, you were young-ish then. It honestly would be more, frankly, my mother-in-law Connie, who's about 10 years older than you, Mom. She'd be the one, and because she was in the South, because she was Black, she was the one that I turned to a lot, just for a general understanding. But really, again, those oral histories, the interviews from that time, if I needed to understand Birmingham, I could. There was a way to do it.
Do you find any evidence in your research that the events at Birmingham uh, sparked the self-defense activism of groups like Deacons for Defense?
I don't have any direct evidence of that, no. Although I would say that in general, there's a sense that like every nonviolent movement kind of begets the next. Like what Gandhi's doing in India becomes, because King reads about it in seminary, becomes what King tries to put in place in the late 50s and early 60s.
I, for one, grew up on the last racist shot, Dr. King. Dr. King. Then we solved racism narrative in school.
Oh.
How do you think we can better teach our children about this history and its effect on us all today?
Great question. Read the books. Do not ban the books. Read the books. I would say, there's this. I was saying this in a couple other interviews. Like one other quick point of that. On the right now, you see how Mark Twain was right. How history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. On the right now, you see the book bans, the book burnings. Even it's like, what the hell are we doing? And then so that needs to stop. And then on the left, you see this weird fixation with skin tone as the ultimate sort of primer of everything that identifies a person. For instance, and I talk about this a little bit in the epilogue, like right now at Berkeley, there is Black and Indigenous people of color housing, off-campus housing, where white people are not allowed to enter. At NYU last year, the student body decided that Black people should be housed separately from white people, should be housed separately from Asian people. And my wife and I, among others, who are kind of Gen X and are looking at the Gen Zs and the millennials, like, what are you kids doing? Are kind of wondering, like, that not only what are you doing, but like, is that really the future that Shuttlesworth would have envisioned either? Like, there is an underlying humanity beneath all of us. Yes, some of our experiences are vastly different because of our skin tone. Let us never lose sight of that. That's why you read the books, but also let us not fixate exclusively on those skin tones.
Our governor doesn't want our children to feel bad about our history. Would your book make people feel bad?
I would love it if your governor banned my book. No, that would do a number for sales. Beaverdale Books and we could do a brisk business then. Look, history is barbaric. It's not just this. Any history is hard. You want to read a great book? Well, say read that, but I would also say Steven Pinker, one of the psychologists at Harvard, he wrote this book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And it's a brilliant, brilliant book because it basically shows how, yes, history is barbaric, but across, as King would say, the great arc of history, there is justice. And that whole book shows how we are actually improving our morality across generations and centuries. We are actually becoming more humane to each other. And I would argue that it is because of us being familiar with our collective history that allows us to then say, well, in what ways can we still improve?
Did I already ask you what you wanted readers to take away from this? That was a question.
Yeah, I mean, I think more than anything, I want people to. I'm from Iowa. We're here in Des Moines. This is a book about 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama. But this is all of our stories. 1963 made possible our lives in ways that perhaps we don't even recognize on a day-to-day basis. I would even say that it's more than that. I think this is the greatest story America can ever tell about itself. What happened in those 10 weeks, what those guys in the SCLC did, the position the Kennedy brothers ultimately adopt, it shows, again, what King says, that the arc of history bends toward justice, right?
Um, let's see. Do you know what your next research project will be?
I do indeed.
Last question, is that right? Is this the last question, Tim? Okay.
Okay. I'll let you guys in on a secret. In 2021, after the fall of Kabul, a small band of special forces operatives got together and they said, good, we have saved 130,000 wartime allies from Afghanistan. But guess what? There were 350,000 wartime allies with whom we fought across 2 decades of war. That means there are 200,000 people right now being literally headhunted by the Taliban, burned alive, publicly executed. What can we do? They get together and they decide to do the thing that the US government does not want them to do, that their own military says, we will never allow this. They decide to go back into Afghanistan. And their mission is the final mission, as they call it. It's also going to be the book's title. The final mission is this: let's get them all out. Every single wartime ally that served alongside us for 20 years. Let's get them all out. And they have saved President Biden's bodyguard. They have saved 4 people with whom Prince Harry served. Last year, 2 of the guys, 2 of them brothers from Omaha, so I'll be back in the Midwest researching this book, were detained by the Taliban and nearly beaten to death across 4 months. First thing they said when they got out, let's run more missions. So that will be the final mission.
Okay, while your hands are together, let's give a round of applause again for Paul for being here tonight. And just one reminder before we break for him to sign books. Just want to remind you that the final AViD event is next Thursday, June 15th, and that will be Taylor Harris. So now, in the spirit of marketing, you can go over there and Paul will sign a book and Beaverdale will sell a book. So, thank you.
Hey, buddy.